Sir, I have to ask you, given that we are only working on sources at this point, will you be leading the transition team at the State Department?
I don't have any comment on that. Howard Lutnick and Linda McMahon are leading it for President Trump, and he has made two great choices in them. Becky, you mentioned policy in the region. President Trump prioritized the Middle East in his first term, and he was very successful at, I think, restoring stability and prosperity in the region. I think it's quite significant that the day after his historic win, he had conversations with the leaders of Saudi Arabia, UAE, Israel, and Egypt. And so these were day one phone calls. And as Becky, as you know, President Trump's first foreign trip was to the Middle East. And as a consequence of a great strategy toward the Middle East, focusing on shared interests, he was able to, I think, make a number of significant accomplishments that the leaders in the region all recognize as successful. And so he has a lot of friendships in the region with leaders. Those friendships have, I think, are only going to deepen. And I think the cooperation and the bonds of friendship, security, and commerce are all going to be much better in the coming years.
So let's talk about policy on the Middle East very specifically then, because this is a different place to a degree than it was back in 2020 when you were successful in bringing about the Abraham Accords with 4 Arab states, and we're looking towards normalization with the key sort of trophy, as it were, Saudi Arabia. Since then, of course, we have had the conflict roiling since the terror attack on Israel back on October the 7th. 2 wars raging in region, one on Gaza, one in Lebanon. Attacks between Israel and Iran. And a Gulf which, frankly, is getting extremely tired with conflict, wants to see de-escalation, economic integration, and to move on from this cycle of wars, conflict, this cycle of containment. So what is Donald Trump's policy on the Middle East? Can you be clear at this point? All we've heard at this point is there won't be any wars. There will be peace in the Middle East. That sounds very basic to many people here. So what is his policy?
Well, Becky, everything that you just described about today's Middle East, you could have said in 2020 when President Trump came into office. You had a terrorist caliphate in the heart of the Middle East. You had our Gulf partners feeling betrayed by the Iran nuclear deal. And you had increased attacks by Iranian proxies. President Trump came to the Middle East in Riyadh at that Arab Muslim summit. 55 nations were there. And he laid out a very coherent strategy for how we are going to focus on shared interests. We're going to combat ideologies that are killing not only American troops in the region, but also citizens of Arab and Muslim nations. And we're going to do that in a spirit of friendship and partnership. And so over the course of those 4 years, he executed against that strategy, defeated ISIS, put Iran in a political and financial crisis, deepened his ties with Israel, deepened his ties with our Gulf partners, got out of the Iran nuclear deal, and did 4 peace treaties in 5 months. I would be very happy to put President Trump's record in the Middle East against any other president.
Let's talk about a solution to the Gaza crisis first and foremost. Do you have any further insight into how Donald Trump is going to stop that conflict successfully and provide a pathway to an independent Palestinian state?
I think a lot of what you just described, Becky, is a consequence of a failure of deterrence. And if the United States, working with our Gulf partners in Israel, are not able to deter Iran and its proxies, you have war and violence and bloodshed in the Middle East. And if you take a policy of appeasement and accommodation with Iran and increase the daylight between America's partners, calling countries pariahs and lecturing them on how they're supposed to live, you lose deterrence. And if nobody believes that you have a credible
Right.
threat of military force, then you're going to lose deterrence. And so I think President Trump, as he demonstrated during the 4 years of his first term, weakened Iran economically and militarily, and weakened its proxies, and he deepened his alliances with Israel and Gulf partners. And if you do that, it's a winning formula. If you do the opposite, which is the policy of the Biden administration, you have the Middle East that you just accurately described, Becky.
So what does that look like going forward then for a Trump administration? You're slightly swerving my very specific questions about policy going forward. Both Trump and Vance have said that they don't want war with Iran. We know the balance of power has shifted, though. What does that policy look like? Are you going after, for example, another policy of maximum pressure? Do you expect Donald Trump to be after regime change, for example? What does it look like? What will the US policy under Trump and Vance look like with regard to Iran?
Well, I think, look, Becky, President Trump's foreign policy is hiding in plain sight, and I'm not swerving any of your answers. I just think that it's fairly obvious what he did in the first term, and it's obvious, that he isolated Iran and he weakened Iran economically. And you talked about a regional balance of power shifting. Israel has had enormous success against Hamas and Hezbollah, which are two terrorist proxies of Iran, Muslim Brotherhood offshoots, and part of this sort of extremist ideology that President Trump worked with leaders in Saudi Arabia and UAE and Egypt to combat. I have no reason to think that he won't do that again, and he was very successful at it. The leaders in the region that I described enjoyed working with President Trump, and I think that they're looking forward to him coming back into office. In fact, I'm sure of it.
Do you expect the Gulf countries to support a further policy of maximum pressure? For example, further escalation between Israel and Iran, if that is what Donald Trump is supporting?
President Trump understands that the chief driver of instability in today's Middle East is the Iranian regime. And the Gulf is, I think, the most sort of economically dynamic and culturally vibrant region in the world today. And this sort of extremism and revolutionary ideology that the Iranian regime exports is one of the obstacles, right, to continuing on this good path. And when the United States decides to seek accommodation with Iran, it then creates the space for other countries to do the same. But in my personal experience, I know that when we deter the Iranian regime, you have the countries that you described who are on the front lines of Iranian aggression, doing everything they can to be a part of that deterring Iran. President Trump has no interest in regime change. The future of Iran will be decided by the Iranian people. I think we've said that repeatedly over 4 years. But what President Trump did say in Riyadh was that he would isolate Iran diplomatically and weaken them economically so that they can't fund all of the violence that's going with the Houthis in Yemen, Hamas, Hezbollah, PIJ, and these proxies that run around Iraq and Syria today, all of whom destabilize Israel and our Gulf partners.
Brian Hook, do you expect Donald Trump and whoever is his Secretary of State going forward to be willing to pursue Palestinian statehood for a deal?
If you look at the really important work that Jared Kushner did when he was essentially leading so much of the diplomacy in the Middle East, he put forward a political and economic vision for peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians that many Arab governments officially said was a credible, good faith effort, and they called for both sides to come to the table. That plan, which Israel endorsed, had a path to a two-state solution. This war, the October 7th attack by Hamas, has really not put anybody in much of a mood to be talking about this subject, because obviously Hamas doesn't believe in a two-state solution, nor do they want a ceasefire. And after what Hamas did on October 7th, there are many Israelis right now who are focused on other things, specifically keeping them safe from this kind of evil terrorism that they endured on October 7th. And so I think that if you look at the plan that Jared put forward during the first term, that has all of the elements that Prince Faisal discussed in his interview with you. And I'm confident that that sort of thinking and working with the Palestinians and the Israelis, as much as circumstances will allow, are going to do a lot. We have no plan, not one plan from the Biden administration on peace between Israel and Palestine. But we put forward many hundreds of pages of economic and political vision for peace between them. And I think so much of that work is still relevant today.